All right, how's that? Okay. But today I'm going to be talking about my specific research that I did for my master's thesis, which I gained in August of this year. It's a little sciencey. I'm not going to talk about like, what kind of graphing and stuff we used for it, but it is a little on the sciencey side, but not too much jargon. So don't worry about that. Before I get started, though, I want to say that my research and all of the Boreal Chickadee research that we've done was funded by the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, and my specific research was also funded through UMD. So thanks for the cash. All right, let me see. This is, oh, yep, no, it's working now. Okay, so just a general outline of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce you to the study species, the Boreal Chickadee. I'm going to talk a little bit about their general ecology and their conservation status. I'll describe the overarching goal of my research, and then I'll get into the 3 individual studies that went into it. And then I'll talk about the results of each of those 3 studies and what they could mean when they are considered holistically in my discussion section. And because the lab that I work in, Dr. Grindy's Avian Ecology Lab, we really believe that research should be applicable with the intent on informing management projects. I'm also going to touch upon how these results can be used for future conservation efforts for the species. And then I'll save some time for any questions that people have about Boreal chickadees in the study. So let's just get into it. So Boreal chickadees are a member of the Paridae family, which includes tits and other chickadees. So within Paridae, they are grouped in what is called the brown-capped clade. And an interesting trait associated with the members of the brown-capped clade is that they all lack a territorial or like a broadcast song. So, lots of passerines, most passerines have a song, like a ritualized song that's complex that they'll repeat over and over again to for mating or to establish territory. And Boreal chickadees don't have that. And you might be wondering, well, like, what do other chickadees have? If you think of black-capped chickadees, right, in the spring or even today, because it was really warm out and there are some confused youngsters, they do like that, right? So that's their broadcast or territory song. And Boreal chickadees and other brown-capped clade chickadees don't have that. So they just have that more standard chickadee call. And I do have like a little clip of it here, which hopefully it comes through. Yeah. Okay. So it sounds a lot like our black-capped chickadee is, but it's a little. I like to say that it kind of sounds like a black-capped chickadee that is like a heavy smoker. Like it's just kind of like a little bit like haggard, like chickadee. There we go. So that is their call. So because the study that I did focuses on breeding ecology, I wanted to touch upon just like some of the basics. So Boreal chickadees, like most other chickadees, they are cavity nesters. So they'll nest in old woodpecker holes or just like other natural cavities. And they'll do like a little bit of excavating like other chickadees do. Which both the male and the female will help with getting out some of that like extra debris within the cavity. But then once the cavity is all set, the female is actually the one that will build the whole nest. And she will build it out of sphagnum moss. So they live in primarily peatlands. So they'll use moss. They'll also line their nests with some grasses, different animal fur, and down. They'll typically have just one brood a season, although we have observed them attempting a second brood if something happens to the first one or if like one of the adults dies. In Minnesota, their breeding season begins early to mid-May, and we've observed most nests being fledged by early July. So here's the range of the boreal chickadee and the habitat. So boreal chickadees live pretty much exclusively in the northern boreal coniferous forests. They are forest, interior, and area sensitive. So that means that they require large areas of habitat, and they prefer to live in the core or the inner part of the forest as opposed to like the edges. And in Minnesota, they're at the very southern edge of their range. And here in Minnesota, they are associated with mature, old growth, black spruce, tamarack bogs. They're permanent residents, which means that they don't have regular migrations, but they have been known to have periods of eruptions where they will move outside of their natural range or their usual range. It's all natural. So here in Minnesota, they are listed as a species in greatest conservation need by the DNR, with declines attributed to habitat loss and fragmentation. Results from the long-term Minnesota National Forest Breeding Bird Monitoring Program, which is a study conducted by the Avian Ecology Lab that I work for on bird populations in the Superior and the Chippewa National Forests, is showing declines of the number of boreal chickadees that are being detected on their surveys, on their yearly point counts. And this is not shown here, but these studies have also shown that, that detections are decreasing in the more southern surveys that they are doing, which is suggesting that they're being pushed further north in the last few decades. And that's pretty much in line with the regional trends. So the North American Breeding Bird Survey has also found a negative trend in their region-wide survey results. And this figure on the right is from eBird data, which is also, again, reiterating these observations of population declines. So climate change is one of the main obstacles that this species face. They are highly vulnerable to climate change. As temperatures warm, those boreal coniferous forests that they live in are predicted to recede north, and they're likely to be replaced by shrubs, grasslands, or more deciduous tree species. So that means that the boreal chickadee's range is also going to be pushed further and further north. So this is a figure from Cornell, which shows the predicted range of boreal chickadees if the temperatures are to increase by 3 degrees, which is what is expected to occur by 2080. And so this extreme loss of range will be experienced by most of the 300 or so bird species that breed in or are adapted to these boreal forests. Yeah, it's a bummer. In addition to habitat loss solely due to climate change, these conditions in boreal forests are exacerbated by anthropogenic factors such as logging and peat mining. So black spruce, the boreal chickadee's tree of choice, is a highly valuable commercial resource. And in Minnesota, spruce harvest has been increasing in the last couple of decades. So boreal chickadees and, for that matter, any other species or wildlife that live in boreal forests are losing habitat by kind of like multiple angles. Water here. All right, so that kind of summarizes the boreal chickadee's status. So it might seem like we know a lot about them, but in fact, they're a really understudied species. And one reason is that they're just a really a hard to study bird. They occur in like really low densities in hard to reach places like bogs. Has anybody ever been in the middle of a bog in the summer? Yeah, it is hard to find researchers that will do that. And as I said earlier, they lack that broadcast song, right? So even if you're out there doing point counts, you might not detect them because they're not singing continuously all the time. So they're just a really hard to study bird. So the gaps in knowledge are many. So some things that we don't really know about these birds are exactly how large their territory sizes are. There are very, very few studies on these birds in the winter. Like, how are they surviving the winter? What's their diet in the winter? What's the nature of their flocking? What's causing these eruptions? Why do they lack a broadcast song? There are a few different theories on that. And also the ecology of nestlings. And also, for that matter, just breeding in general. There are very few studies on Boreal chickadee breeding. And in fact, the most comprehensive breeding study on this bird is from a single study from the 1970s in Algonquin Park in Ontario. So very little known. But we do know that habitat loss and fragmentation are likely the main drivers of declines for the species and most species that are in decline. But how specifically are these factors impacting populations in Minnesota? So I wanted to look at how fragmentation might be impacting breeding for Boreal chickadees, because if we are able to identify where, how, and why we are losing birds in a population, then we can potentially help to mitigate further declines. And anything that we can do to increase breeding will help bolster populations. So just really quick, brief definition of what I mean when I'm talking about fragmentation. So fragmentation refers to the breaking up of large contiguous tracts of habitat into a number of smaller bits of habitat. So of course this means like an overall loss of habitat, but that also means a reduction of like that core area. Remember, I was talking about how Boreal chickadees really kind of prefer that core area. And it also means an increased edge. And many studies have noted and documented negative edge effects. So that might mean that there is higher predation rates or higher nest parasitism near edges. So fragmentation can harm birds in many ways. So that's kind of like a brief overview of fragmentation, but I also wanted to talk about what I mean by quality habitat, because I've been saying, like, what is a quality habitat for birds? And it's really not that simple. So, how do we measure habitat quality? It's not really that straightforward as it might sound. There are different ways to go about this. So older studies on habitat quality would look at things like male bird density or distribution of organisms to infer quality. However, we now know that density or distribution, that can be misleading. So there might be unobvious reasons why there would be more birds in a lower quality habitat or less birds in a higher quality habitat. And for many species, their habitat needs will differ depending on their age and what season it is. So there are kind of like two other approaches that an ecologist can take to measure habitat quality. So one, you can measure habitat attributes directly. So you can look at critical resources such as nesting sites or food abundance. And you can also assess the ecological restraints, like the negatives, such as predation risks or competition. Or you can actually measure the organism to show habitat quality. So that means looking at demographic measures like reproduction, survival, recruitment, and individual condition, like body condition or physiological condition. And looking at the individual is important because, in fact, habitat quality impacts on the individual level, and then that's carried on over into the population. So ideally, a study that aims to measure habitat quality will use a combination of approaches and methods, and then use statistical methods to determine if there is an association between measurements of like vegetation or landscape features, which can then be managed for. Because as ecologists, we tend to focus on what's observable, but if we want research to be meaningful and useful, especially in terms of conservation, we have to determine what's changeable. Into my research, we conducted our research in the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area in northern Minnesota. Has anybody been to the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area? Yes. I highly recommend it. It is a hidden gem for boreal birds, hawk owls, great grays, boreal chickadees. Connecticut warblers. It's just a really, really cool place. If anybody is interested in talking about birding there, hit me up afterwards. Anyways, it's the largest WMA in the state. It has over 86,000 hectares, half of which are that lowland conifer, like that peat, that boreal lowland peat bog habitat, which is the primary habitat of boreal chickadees. And lowland conifer forests in the WMA are actively logged for black spruce, and they're primarily using the traditional method of clear cutting, which does cause fragmentation across the landscape. So in order to investigate the impacts of fragmentation on boreal chickadee breeding, we put up 300 nest boxes. I say we, but I had actually nothing to do with it, and it sounded like terrible. So I just want to shout out to my team that actually did that. They put up 300 nest boxes in black spruce stands across the WMA. And these stands that we put the nest boxes in, they were variable in the size and the shape and also the degree of isolation from other habitat patches, which made for like a really interesting study design. So for the first part of my study, I examined the impacts of fragmentation on provisioning rates, nestling body condition, and nestling growth rates. And I chose these measures because they can all be indicators of habitat quality, right? So provisioning rates can tell us something about food availability. And the same goes with growth rates and body condition of the nestlings before they leave the nest. So also pre-fledged body condition has also been linked to annual survival and recruitment. So thinking about that population level. And some of the specific questions I asked in the study were, do these factors that I'm measuring, do they vary with fragmentation or food availability? What about between the study sites or the year? Is fragmentation affecting, do fragmentation or habitat qualities impact food availability? And also I wanted to see if provisioning rates are varying between the nestling age. And to accomplish this, I use a variety of methods, which I will get into in a little bit of detail. We conducted arthropod surveys. So in order to assess food availability for boreal chickadees, we did systematic arthropod or bug surveys using the branch clipping method at each of my study sites. So basically, there's this two-person thing. One of us, that's me there with a long pole with a big bag on it, would go out. We would pick a good branch, put the bag over, and then my partner, Steve Colby, would come with one of those really long, like shears, pruning shears, and then cut the branch off into the bag. We would quickly seal it up, and then later I would go and see any kind of bugs that were on it. And we use the branch clipping method because boreal chickadees, when they are foraging, they glean insects off of branches. And they actually, somebody did a study on this in the 70s on boreal chickadee foraging, and they're gleaning that food mostly from the the outer part of the branches. And I was interested in those provisioning rates because provisioning rates can be used as a proxy for habitat quality. So if you think about it, if you're a parent bird and you're leaving the nest to go find food for your nestling, and there is a bunch of food available around you, you won't have to travel very far before you fill your beak, and then you can go back to your nestlings and feed them. So if you're able to provision more often, that can show that there is more food available in the habitat, and it's more abundant. So essentially, higher provisioning rates can mean that there is more food available. I will say this, though, on the other hand, during the time that I was getting my master's degree in 2001, a study in Canada came out specifically on boreal chickadee nestling provisioning. And I know, when that paper came out, like my heart sank because I was like, this is my work. But they found that actually boreal chickadee parents will actually increase their provisioning to like make up for poor quality prey. So they found that if the prey items are poor quality, like, bugs with less fat, maybe more chitin or hard parts, if those were more available, they would actually provision more just to give more food because it was lower quality to kind of make up for that difference. And I'm going to get to that later. So higher provisioning rates can mean higher quality, but it could also potentially mean lower prey quality around, which would mean low. I mean, like, they kind of muddied the waters a little bit. So to obtain provisioning observations, what I did, it was very simple. I just took a camera setup into the forest and I set up a tripod and filmed Boreal chickadee nests for an hour. And I would later go back and mark down feeding events. So I'm going to show you some videos of it because it's actually pretty neat. The first couple clips are going to be just like pretty regular feeding events of what I would count as a feeding event. And then also, because I had these cameras on nests for so long, I actually got some really interesting predation attempts caught on camera, which I'll show a couple of those too. All right, so we're going to start out with just some regular feeding events. It should start. There we go. The other parent was like about to leave then, so. Then there's a little feeding event. This is a little bit later. This is neat also because you can see that this bird is banded. It has some color bands on its leg. And so this was a nestling that we banded the year before it came back. All right, here's a predation attempt from a red squirrel. Those were the main nest predators. And I kind of don't like red squirrels anymore. I thought they were all right before, but they eat babies. I think it made contact there. All right, last one, another predation attempt. The pine martin. Yeah, they have massive pods. It's like a white-throated sparrow back there checking things out. What are you doing here? This pine martin did eventually give up, and these nestlings did fledge. I can't say the same about the squirrel one though. This pine martin video was the very last provisioning video that I watched after watching them for like 24 hours. So it was like the coolest treat. All right. The nest boxes, I mean, yeah, well, when you put a nest box up, it looks a little bit different, right? So nest boxes, there is a little bit of a risk with that because they draw attention. Same with bears. Well, we didn't have any bears in this case, but like, it looks a little bit different and predators and mammals are curious. Oh, how deep are the nests? Like the nesting material, like probably 3.5 inches. Yeah, they're in there. So if a predator wants to get in there, if a squirrel wants to get in there, it has to chew. It has to basically spend hours chewing the whole box open, which some of them did. All right. I actually like the questions in the middle. It makes it a little bit more casual. All right. So I also was looking at nestling growth rates, right, and body condition. So I would measure the nestlings. I measured them 3 separate times once on day 6, once on day 10, and then finally on day 15 or 16 when we banded them and also put transmitters on them for the other part of the study. I calculated like a body condition index by, okay, this is a little bit of mathy science. I calculated the residuals of a linear regression of nestling body mass onto tarsal length. Not that important. And then I calculated growth rates by simply taking like the last measurement and then, you know, subtracting the first one and then just dividing by the number of days to get like a rough estimate of like how many grams that they're growing per day. So going back to thinking about habitat quality, so the forest characteristics around the area that might influence faster growth rates and healthier, fatter chicks are going to be good indicators of what is high quality habitat for those birds. And the opposite is true for poorer quality habitat. So we also conducted vegetation surveys within those stands where we put the nest boxes up just to get an idea of like what the specific habitat around those nest boxes were. So we did 20 systematic surveys at each of the different study stands where we had the boxes up. And we looked at average canopy density, total tree counts, and what species of trees were present, which, you know, spoiler, it's like mostly black spruce and some tamarack, a couple birch. We looked at the canopy composition and also average tree height. And then we used those results from the vegetation surveys to be used as predictor variables for our modeling that we did later. So I was also looking at fragmentation, right? So I wanted to calculate different measures of fragmentation of those study stands within the landscape. And animals can respond to fragmentation at many different scales. So to get like a more complete picture, I calculated fragmentation metrics on 3 different spatial scales. So I did like a landscape scale, so like a large scale, which I defined as like a 3-kilometer radius around the nest site. And then I did a patch scale landscape metric. So I'm just like looking at that stand that they're in. What's the shape of that black spruce stand that they're in? How much edge is there? What's the size of the stand that they're nesting in? And then I also looked at nest specific measurements. So what does the area look like just right around the nest? Are they close to an edge? Are there multiple habitat areas around their nest box? So those are some of the things that I was looking at to be used to kind of describe what might be happening with like the nestlings. I was talking about those arthropod surveys, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the results from that. So from all of those branches, I identified 353 different individuals from 11 orders. I started to try to identify them at the family level, which I pretty quickly realized is for like serious bug people. So we went to just the order because I was like, yes, I can tell that this is a dragonfly or a spider or whatever. And I found that in 2021, the first year of the study, the most abundant orders were Araenia or spiders, and then Diptera. So those are like flies. And then in 2022, Araenia spiders were still the most abundant, and then true bugs, Hemiptera, were the second most abundant. And then I also looked at the diversity of orders to quantify food availability that I would also use later in my modeling. So more results. So I videotaped nestling provisioning at young age when they were like little nestlings, 6 to 7 days old. And I found that parents would feed nestlings on average around 2 times per nestling per hour. And then when they got a little bit older, day 10, they were coming around like a little over 3 times per nestling per hour. And I found that they were feeding them significantly more when they were older than younger. That's not new news, though. Lots of other studies have shown that parents feed their young more when they're older because they're bigger and they need more food. I looked at growth rates, and they averaged about 1/2 gram a day. And there was not a difference between growth rates between the 2 study years. And then finally, I looked at how big they were before they left the nest. And they were around 11 grams for both years. All right, a little mathy, but I think I can make it a little bit easy to understand. So I used some generalized linear mixed models to analyze provisioning rates and nestling growth rates. And some of my top models showed that early provisioning rates, so when they were younger, those were correlated with the distance of the nest site to the edge of the forest. So that meant that as when the nest box was actually closer to the edge, provisioning rates were higher. And I also looked at nestling growth rates, and I found that those were positively influenced by the percentage of black spruce cover type on the nest site and the landscape scale. So that meant that nestlings were growing faster when they were surrounded by more of that preferred habitat of mature black spruce around them. I also looked at pre-fledged body condition, and I found that pre-fledged body condition was correlated with arthropod diversity within the site. So those study stands that had higher diversity of arthropods also had nestlings with higher pre-fledged body condition. And then I wanted to see, like, well, what's affecting arthropod diversity, if that seems to be like an important thing. And I found that that was correlated with the amount of black spruce in the landscape, and also the heterogeneity of tree density. So that means, like, if there were in a study stand some areas that were like dense, had like really dense pockets of trees, and then some that were a little less dense. Stands that had that mix of denser and less dense areas had higher arthropod diversity. And also when there was more black spruce habitat around, arthropod diversity was higher as well. So just to kind of summarize that up, nestling growth rates were associated with the amount of black spruce forest in the landscape. Nestling reared in stands with higher arthropod diversity had a better pre-fledged body condition. And arthropod diversity was correlated with the amount of black spruce forest in the landscape and the variability in the stand structure. So complex black spruce stands, higher arthropod diversity, bigger nestlings, and faster growth rates. I also looked at nest survival. So red squirrels, common nest predators. So one well-documented consequence of fragmentation on birds is lower breeding success. And as I mentioned earlier, several studies have found that lower nest survival is linked to things like patch size and also edge effects. So I wanted to investigate whether fragmentation was impacting Boreal chickadee nest survival in the Red Lake WMA. So this part of my study involved nest box monitoring, so checking nest box often to determine what their fate was, and then survival modeling using this program called the MC Estimate. So some of like the specific questions I was looking at: does fragmentation appear to impact nest survival? What scale? What other factors could influence nest survival? What about the age of nest? What about, is there a difference in nest survival between the 2 years of our study? What about just the study sites? So we would check nest boxes starting in early to mid-May. We would note if there was any sign of nesting activity, and then we would check them really regularly, starting one day before when we expected them to hatch, and then daily until hatching occurred. And then after hatching, I would check them 1 to 3 times during the duration of the nestling period, and then note the fate of the nest, whether it was believed to be depredated or abandoned, or whether it successfully fledged. So some of the results: we ended up monitoring 35 Boreal chickadee nests between 2020 and 2022. So this includes an extra year of study. Of those 35 nests, 10 failed. 8 of those were depredated, eaten. and 2 of them were apparently abandoned. And I used that program to model nest survival. And some of the top performing models that I had to explain nest survival included the age of nest. So I have like a little graph of it there. As you can see, as a nest gets older, as it goes from eggs to fledgling, there is less chance that it will survive to the next day. And that kind of makes sense if you've ever watched a nest as nestlings hatch and they get older. There's a lot more activity around that nest as parents are coming in to provision and feed their young. So that's drawing a lot more attention to nest predators. And this result of the age of nest being really important with nest survival is really common and seen for most studies on nest survival. But I was also looking at some of those habitat measurements. And I found that, again, that the amount of black spruce around the nesting location was important, and that there was higher survival when there was more black spruce as opposed to other habitat types. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. For a nest to be successful, it just means at least one has fledged. Yep, that's a good question, because I didn't have this in my study, but lots of studies will have like partial nest predation. But if any of those fledge, it's considered successful. Also, if they fledge and just get like roasted by predators right away, like it's still considered when you're modeling that it was a successful fledge. And we did have that happen a couple times, and it was really sad. So again, summary, Boreal chickadee breeding success is higher when nesting locations are surrounded by greater amounts of black spruce. It seems like we have a theme here. Larger areas of black spruce forests appear to be beneficial for Boreal chickadees by both increasing nest success and also producing nestlings with a better body condition. All right, and then finally, I want to talk about, this is kind of my favorite part of my study, the nestling diet. So, understanding diet is pretty crucial for having the full picture of the ecology of a species, and it can also be useful for conservation, particularly if you want to manage habitat for food availability. So, some of the specific questions that I aimed to answer were like, what food is available to provisioning parents? And we figured that out, or we got an idea of that with the arthropod surveys. And then what are nestlings eating? Are Boreal chickadee parents selecting certain prey items when they're feeding their young? And are there differences between the diet between those different study sites around the WMA, or what about between the 2 years? And are nestlings being fed different food items at different stages of their life? And to do this, I used these methods, which I'll go over in detail. So again, when we're determining what food is available, we use those arthropod surveys I talked about earlier. And then I used DNA metabar coding to determine the diet of nestling Boreal chickadees. So you might be thinking like, well, how can we use DNA to determine diet? Well, the answer lies in their poop. So when we eat, the DNA of the food that we ate is actually conserved as it goes through our digestive tract, and it comes out in feces. So you can analyze feces and see what DNA is present and determine what the diet is. So I collected fecal sacs from nestlings when they were 6 days old and 10 days old and 15 days old. And then I extracted the DNA from those fecal samples, and I amplified specific parts of the DNA that I was interested in through PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, which is a laboratory technique that is used for producing or amplifying many copies of a specific gene for identification purposes. So I used these specific, they're called primers, to amplify the arthropod mitochondrial cytochrome C oxidase 1 gene. I couldn't actually tell you what that gene does, to be honest. This is what people use. And then I compared those gene sequences to the ones that I found in their poop to this like massive reference database called the Barcode of Life database. And this allowed me to identify many of those genes to specific arthropod orders, families, genera, and even some down to like specific species level. So again, just a reminder, the results of the arthropod surveys that will come in, that will be useful for the next couple slides. So the results from my DNA metabar coding, I extracted DNA from 105 nestling fecal samples. Don't ask me how actually, you can ask me later how I got those. It's not easy. We detected 10 different arthropod orders in their poop, and we also detected 123 unique arthropod species. So what are nestlings eating? So the most frequently occurring arthropod orders detected in fecal samples were Diptera, so like flies and such. And then those were found in 94% of fecal samples had a Diptera. Lepidoptera, naturally, of course, right? Caterpillars, Arania, so spiders, and then Hemiptera, or true bugs. We also found lots of Coleoptera, beetles, mayflies, and caddisflies were detected in over 20% of the samples. So, were there differences in diet between the study sites or years? Well, Arania or spiders were detected at a higher occurrence in 2022 than 2021. And also Trichoptera were found in higher amounts in 2022 than in 2021. And this I think is really interesting. So Trichoptera, they're the caddisflies, right? They require a lot of water for their larval stage. And if any of you can recall, 2021 was that massive drought year. And working out in the bog, it was like, you could go out there in a t-shirt. Like, it was insane. There were no bugs out there, which I imagine is because of that drought. And I wonder if caddisflies were a lot less abundant around them in that year because of that drought. And you can see in 2022, which was like the non-drought year, they were detected in over a quarter of samples. So that implies that they're probably an important prey item for boreal chickadees. So this makes me wonder how drought might be affecting boreal chickadees and just other birds in general in the future, as climate change might make that more of a problem. And we're actually starting to go back to this DNA data to see if there might be a finer differences in different families or genera that are found in the chickadee poop samples, to see if there are more instances of water reliant arthropods being found less in 2021 than 2022. So that's kind of what we're working on now. So are boreal chickadee parents selecting certain items when they're feeding their young? So we did find that that Diptera were found more frequently in poop than were in the surveys that we had. And I do want to talk really quickly about biases and sampling methods. So I've talked about earlier how we were sampling the trees by using the branch clipping method, right? So I'd go out there and I'd put a bag over a branch. Well, that works really good for slow moving or sessile insects, but it's not so great if you're trying to get all of the flying insects that might be on a branch, because they'll see your bag coming and they'll fly away. So there is a little bit of a bias. So it's possible that difference between how often it was found in poop and how often it was found in samples or the surveys could just be because they were flying away and so they didn't get into the bag. But we also did find that there was a huge difference in how often Lepidoptera were showing up in the poop versus the branch samples. And Lepidoptera or caterpillars are actually really slow moving. So branch clipping is a really effective method for catching those. So that's actually probably reflecting some degree of selection. And that makes sense. We kind of know that that parent birds are selecting for caterpillars when they're feeding their young because they're high in fat and they're easily digestible. I also wanted to see if parents were feeding their young different foods at different ages, and the answer was not really. So they're feeding them pretty much the same thing, whether they're young or old. Not very exciting. But back to that kind of initial question of is fragmentation impacting the quality of habitat for breeding boreal chickadees? Well, let's look at what we've discussed so far. So nestling growth rates were positively influenced by the percentage of black spruce forest. Pre-fledged body condition was correlated with arthropod diversity in the study site, and arthropod diversity was positively associated with the amount of black spruce forest within the landscape and the heterogeneity of black spruce tree density within the stand. So if you look at all this together, this suggests that large, structurally complex black spruce forests are quality habitat for breeding boreal chickadees, as they provide more access to diverse prey, which results in nestlings with higher growth rates and better pre-fledged body condition. Also, the top model explaining nest survival showed an increase in survival with an increase in black spruce. And the age of nest was also an indicator of nest survival. And predation was the main cause of nest failure. So it's possible that nests are more conspicuous to predators as the parents begin provisioning nestlings. But I've also found in my research that other studies have shown that nest predators in the boreal forest specifically are more abundant in fragmented patches, so smaller fragmented patches. So this is, kind of an A plus B kind of thing, or I don't know. But fragmentation might be impacting nest survival for boreal chickadees by increasing predator abundance. And then finally, provisioning rates were higher for nests that were closer to the forest edge. And as I said earlier, provisioning rates have been used as an indicator of food availability. So more food, higher provisioning rates. However, as I mentioned earlier, a recent study on boreal chickadee provisioning showed that they'll actually increase provisioning to compensate for low prey quality. And I also didn't find any correlation between nestling body condition and the distance to the edge. So it's possible that boreal chickadees, it's possible that they're benefiting from nesting closer to the stand edge because of higher prey availability, but it also could be that prey items taken near the edge are not really high quality. And so they're actually increasing their provisioning efforts to compensate for that. So, as we like to say, additional studies should be done to investigate this. We've also seen that chickadee parents provide their young with a wide variety of prey items. So again, we detected prey items from 10 orders, 59 different families, 103 genera, and 123 unique arthropod species. I have that list if anybody is interested in that. Boreal chickadee parents rely pretty heavily on prey items from Lepidoptera, Araneae, and Diptera. And if you look at those results with the prefledged body condition analysis, it does appear that access to a diverse suite of prey items is important for provisioning parents. How are we on time? Okay. I do want to get into this, but if we didn't have time, then I could, So as I said earlier, research is kind of meaningless if you can't put it into practical use. If it's not going to be beneficial, then kind of like, why spend all this time and money? So how can this be used for forest management? So as we've seen, large tracts of black spruce are important for breeding boreal chickadees. The typical method for harvesting black spruce is clear cutting without reserves. So that means just going out and just leveling large areas of it. And climate change has made regeneration of black spruce less certain. So if a stand is going to be logged, which, like I said, it's commercially valuable, so it's pretty hard to tell the Forestry Service that you can't log a certain area, but you can log it in different ways. So alternative methods like strip cutting or shelter wood or selection cutting, those can be like a more favorable option, which will reduce fragmentation. So, yeah, I guess I basically just said it. Harvesting methods that are reducing that fragmentation, moving away from clear cuts without reserves to alternative methods would probably be beneficial for the species. Also, having an insight into what arthropods are being consumed by birds can be advantageous for creating management plans with the goal of increasing food availability. So like, it's pretty neat that I found out what boreal chickadees are eating, but like, what is that good for? Huh. So many arthropods or bugs rely on just like a few host plant species. So if you know what arthropods those birds are eating, that can help conservationists know what plant species to manage for. And also, arthropod diversity has been positively associated with canopy complexity. So again, clear cutting, which results in just even age stands, is going to lower canopy complexity, resulting potentially in low arthropod diversity, which is not good for anything and not good for boreal chickadees. So again, certain practices like clear cutting might be detrimental to food availability for boreal chickadees and other forest dwelling birds. And that sums up my study and my research. These are my acknowledgments. I used these slides for my thesis, so these people don't mean much to you, but I do want to say, yeah, I had a lot of bird poop support by many, many good scientists. But I do want to thank the Bird Lab and UMD for paying me to do this research. And with that, we can open it up and discuss anything that you guys would like. Pretty much, not my personal life. All right. Oh boy. Yeah. Yeah. Those are good questions. Okay. I have I can't tell you like exactly what the inches are off the top of my head. I do have that written down somewhere, but they are basic chickadee size boxes. Um, I can't remember. It's like 8 by something, and like with the something. I mean, it's a pretty standard nest box. And then what was the other question? Oh, how high are they put up? Yeah. So this is something that I wish we could change, but just because of logistics is not really possible. They were pretty much head level because we have to be able to access them and to look into them and to pull the nestlings out to put transmitters and ban them, etc. And also this is deep in a bog and some of it like a couple kilometers into it. So bringing like ladders was not a possibility. So they were about head height, and we do clean them out at the end of the breeding season. Yeah. Oh boy. All right. I think in my thesis, I said that we encouraged them to express, but it's funny with the tree swallows, which I also do poop stuff with. They'll just poop all over you, but they kept their poops to themselves. So basically, when they're really young, when they're unfeathered, you can see if they have like a fecal sac forming at the base of at their cloaca. And so what you kind of do is like you basically gently, very gently pull their cloaca apart. And if it's ready, it will shoot out. And so you have to like, I like would have like my little like vial between like my knees and then like pulling its butt apart over it. It was gross. I don't want to have to do that again, but I think I've like made a name for myself in poop studies. I'm getting different bird poop job offers. So I think that's just like what I'm going to do now, which is kind of cool, I guess. I have a question on this. Wait, should I read any of these off too, or okay? Yeah. Well, somebody asked if there's one thing that you could do to protect boreal chickadees, what would it be? I think that, stopping climate change is not like a good ask for this one. I think we're a little past that, but I don't know. I really would work on changing harvest practices in the country, but also specifically in Minnesota and for black spruce, and also specifically in the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area. And they're doing a lot of work to change some of those practices right now. So yeah, we are definitely moving away from clear cutting, and like newer silviculture practices are coming up and being used. And so that's great. We're on the right track with that. So keep that up. Oh, I also have a question, right? Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of habitat lost. And a lot of those trees that are burning up are dead standing snags, which are the primary nesting sites for those. So that's probably is not good, and they probably lost a lot of nesting locations. Oh. I'll take that one, and then I'll go to the one on the internet. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great. Mm-hmm. Nest boxes. Yeah. Yep. So the question was about like how did we choose the study sites? So first we went to the Red Lake Wildlife Management Area and we looked for stands of mature black spruce. And then we would do like point count we had done point count surveys there. So first of all, just like, are they here? And then with the different stands that we chose, um, unfortunately, because of forestry practices in the last several hundred years, there weren't any large stands for us to use, which is a bummer in the study because it would have been really cool to be able to compare it. So most of them were already fragmented, but we did choose ones that were like stands that were different sizes so that we could compare them. And then what was another part of the question? And yeah, that's a good question too. Our largest study site did have the most nesting in it. But other than that, with the other ones, it wasn't like a very clear trend. So there were some pretty small stands that would still have nesting boreal chickadees in it. And I said that there were 35 that we monitored, but those were just the ones that we monitored that like got to a certain stage. So there was more nests that we had initially that they started to nest in, or maybe they would only lay like 1 or 2 eggs, but we couldn't age those nests if they if they were predated or abandoned too young. So those couldn't be used in the nest survival study. So we did actually have more than 35 that nested. They just didn't get to a certain age that we could include them in the study. Yeah. Anybody have any more? Yeah. Um, well, Canada jays, definitely. Those are really dependent on and then also Connecticut warblers, those aren't residents, but those nest exclusively in that kind of habitat as well. And we've also have done some studies on Connecticut warblers in our lab. I mean, there are a lot of insects in peatland forests, definitely. So I mean, like if you're a breeding bird, there's plenty of food available. As in terms of like why are boreal chickadees associated with black spruce instead of other, I think that has a lot to do with like resource and habitat partitioning. So like um if you are a chickadee and there are other chickadee species around, you want to probably have like a habitat that is different from the other chickadee species so that it lowers competition. And in like deep in those peatland black spruce forests, there was not a lot of black cap chickadee, which would have been which is their main competitor because they occupy similar niches in like their foraging strategies, except for the fact that boreal chickadees are pretty much exclusively feeding on black spruce. Yeah. 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 No, I mean, yeah. If you saw that squirrel one, like they were coming at them, I think there was one incident where that I think that parent like made contact with it. So no, I mean like they're not just sitting back and being like, well, they're winning a lot of resources. They'll make lots of alarm calls. They'll swoop at them. A couple of times when I was getting nestlings out to measure them or whatever, I got swooped at and stuff. They'll make a lot of noise also like away from the nest and try to like lure predators away. So it's actually quite sad to see them like trying to get predators away. Um, mm-hmm. Mm, So that will happen pretty much only if one of the other parents dies. Because it can be just like way too much work for one parent to feed all of the nestlings. Oh, and the question was why does nest abandonment happen or what do parents do to prevent predation? Yeah, so typically parents will abandon nests if one of the other parents dies. And they're like, I can't do this by myself. Or if there are just not enough food resources around. Also, parents will abandon a nest if there's something really weird going on. Like if you for some parents, if you mess with their nest and it looks different or weird, they'll fly up to the nest and they'll be like, nope, I'm not going in there. That looks different than how I left it. And then they might never come back. So those are some of the reasons why. But it's not typically a parent would almost never abandon a nest if everything was going just fine and there are both parents available. They've already put so many resources into building that nest, laying the eggs, and then rearing them, however. So most parents will not readily abandon nests. Even if I go into their nest box and grab their babies and then put them back, if they come back, see that they're still in there, they'll continue feeding. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as you saw that they feed a lot. So even if they weren't there, So the question was, when I'm going to visit the nest boxes, am I interrupting, and are the parents like seeing me go in there? It's pretty hard for them to not see you. So like the whole banding, weighing, measurement take about a half an hour. So that's a lot of time where parents are coming and going and feeding their nestlings. What we do is that when we are taking the nestlings out to measure them, etc., I'll only take out half of them at a time. So I'll leave half of the nestlings in the nest. So that means when the parents are coming to feed, they'll see, okay, my nest is not empty. I'm going to continue to feed these birds, my babies. And then when we're done with that, I'll switch it out and then grab the next ones. And like, yeah, they see me do it and they don't like it. And sometimes they yell. And sometimes they will sit on their nestlings and be like, I'm not getting away. But yeah, they do see it. It's pretty impossible within that period of time for them to have not come back at all. But we don't take them all out so that to avoid something like abandonment. Because if a parent did come and see all of my nestlings are gone, then that could potentially lead to abandonment. Yes. Uh-huh. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. No, but there was one nest that, yeah, oh boy. There was one nest that we had that successfully fledged. And then every nestling just got like totally decimated right outside of the nest. And part of the study was also, as I talked about earlier, tracking the nestlings. So we put radio transmitters on the nestlings before they left the nest box. So then, and that's part of like the larger study. So I would go out there with telemetry equipment to track them. So I went there to track them, and I was like, wait a minute, why are all the tags coming from the ground and there's just body parts? But we would count that as a successful fledge. Somebody was waiting for them. And there's a lot of pine martens, and this was a pretty close to the edge, so there was a lot of like raptors and stuff. So who knows with that box? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. That was fun. Great. Thanks for the questions. And my email's up there. So if anybody has more questions, you can email me. Or if you have bird job offers for me, you can email me there too, because now that I've graduated, I don't know what to do with my life. So